This is David Sloan Wilson for Revolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. My guest today is Jonathan Haidt, famed author of the current bestseller, The Righteous Mind. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, David.
And you've been so much in the news lately with your great book, and I want to make sure that our own talk together covers some new ground. And so of the many things that we could talk about, we've decided to focus on a recent sociological study, which shows that trust in science has been declining among political conservatives for the last few decades. And so our sermon for today is do conservatives place less trust in science than liberals? And I know that you've got great things to say about that, so I'm just going to let you take it from here.
Sure. So one of the themes of my book is that left and right are like yin and yang. Both sides see different threats, are wise to certain possibilities in society. Another related theme is that morality binds and blinds. And when a group circles around sacred objects, sacred values, they then give up the possibility of thinking clearly about whatever they've sacralized. And so it's easy to see this on the right, where some, not all, but some Christian conservatives sacralize the Bible itself, treat it as the Word of God, and then it's like you plant your stake in the ground, you say, this is true. Now, there's evidence coming in about the age of the earth. Well, that can't be right, it must be some trick. So it's easy to see denial of science when it threatens sacred values of Christian conservatives. Many conservatives sacralize the United States. They think America can do no wrong. John Kerry comes back from Vietnam, says we committed war crimes. Well, of course we did. I mean, every war, there's horrible crimes going on. And Republicans say, no, he's a traitor. So it's easy to see that the right denies history, denies science. But what's harder to see is that people on the left, if you know what they hold sacred, you can see where they deny science too, because they'll circle around their sacred beliefs, and then when there's something threatening, they'll reject it. So the study that you mentioned came out in the American Sociological Review, and let's see, I have a graph of one of the graphs from the from the paper here. I'll just narrate it for the viewers. It shows the trust in science based on what your attitudes are towards science and scientists, and I'll just show it very briefly here, but we may be able to know it over.
We'll show an image on the video.
What it basically shows is that the black bars along the top, the black diamonds, are the numbers for liberals, and they stay relatively stable over the last 30 or 40 years. The bar for conservatives was basically at the same level as the liberals in the 60s and 70s, and then beginning in the 90s, it begins to go down while the liberal graph goes up a little bit. And so it is true that in the United States, conservatives they have a lower opinion of science, and there are more obvious places where they deny it. I'm often asked when I speak on the book by people on the left, well, yeah, all that you've said is very interesting, but isn't it still true that our view is based on science and reason and evidence, and theirs is just based on faith and hatred? And I have to say, whoa, hold on a second here. Every group holds things sacred. Every group values the truth. And when the truth and the sacred objects conflict, every group throws truth under the bus. And we've seen this in evolution. Obviously, the Christian right denies evolution because it threatens the creationist account. But the left has denied evolution, certainly since the 70s.
Now that might surprise some people, and both the left and the right are heterogeneous. So, but expand upon your statement that the left have denied evolution. Who among the left has denied evolution?
Well, nobody denies that it happened for other animals. And nobody denies that evolution shaped our bodies. Nobody on the left denies this. But when Ed Wilson suggested that it also seems to have shaped human behavior, whoa! You're opening the door to saying there could be sex differences, there could be race differences. And since what the left sacralizes is equality and anti-racism, they plant their stake in the ground. They say there are no sex differences, there are no race differences. Now, let the evidence sort itself out how it will. These are absolutes. So in my field of psychology, for 30 or 40 years, we had evolution deniers. Nobody said that they couldn't believe that evolution affected us. Just they had such a high bar that you couldn't argue that evolution mattered. They'd always say, well, that's a just so story. Prove it. Run the experiment.
So one way to disbelieve something or to reject it, basically, is not to say that it's flat out false, but to set the bar so high, basically, that nobody could.
Exactly. So that happened for evolution, sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, anything that suggested sex differences, anything that suggests race differences, anything that seems to blame the victim. So the Moynihan report was a famous example where Pat Moynihan, looking at the causes of black poverty, talked about the importance of the black family, and he was derided as a racist. So if you know what a group holds sacred, you see where they go crazy. And I just want to read you a quote from this article, actually this quote by an essay, from an interview with the author. This blew me away, and this to me was the opening to understanding what's going on. So they say, this is a quote from Gordon Gauchat, Gauchat. Public opinion on science in Europe and Japan skews differently than in the United States, Gauchat said. There, skepticism about the scientific community usually comes from the left. The reason may be that the issues on the scientific forefront in Europe, genetically modified food, nuclear power, tend to push liberals' buttons, while those in the United States, climate change, stem cell research, tend to bother conservatives more. So it's an historical artifact that in the US, it is conservatives who deny science more, but that's not because there's something essential about liberalism or conservatism.
So one thing we've done is we've taken what seems to be a political difference, and is a political difference in any particular time and place, and explains the entire pattern in terms of universal human psychology, basically, what anyone will do when they sacralize something or not. But to me, this creates a dilemma, because surely we need to understand what we love and cherish most, much more than what we don't care about. And so is it the case, in your opinion, that if we love something, if we cherish it, if we hold it sacred, then we're actually incapable of studying it scientifically? For me, that would be a very negative prognosis. That's what you think?
Yes, it is. I don't think, if you were a creationist, should you be admitted to a biology department to study evolution? I mean, if I was on the admissions committee, I'd be very concerned about that, because there's certain things they just couldn't think. And then I argue with my colleagues, well, suppose you're a social justice activist and you're applying to my department at UVA or anywhere else to a social psych program because you want to fight racism. So you're going to study racism. How clearly can you think? And how are you different from the creationist?
Well, and this is now a conversation we will continue to have. And we disagree about this, folks, and science is all about, is a process of constructive disagreement. And what I would say, and of course we're not going to get to the bottom of this during this conversation, is that on an average day we're hopelessly biased in one way or another. And so the only reason that we function as scientists is through a social process.
Right, exactly.
We're expected as scientists to do the best we can as individuals, but luckily we have others to hold us accountable, and we have a social system such as the peer review system and other strictures, which basically causes science to be an objective process, sort of, as a social process, not as an individual process, but as a social process.
That's right. But that only works if you have an efficient market, if you have buyers and sellers, if you have people on different sides.
And if you have a uniformity of opinion among everyone in the group, then there's no corrective.
That's right. And that's our problem in social psychology. Generally speaking, it's a very healthy field. I love being a social psychologist. But because there's one conservative social psychologist, one. I put his name is Rick McCauley, he's a friend of mine. And a lot of people said, oh, come on, Haidt's exaggerating. Well, in the last year and a half, nobody's found another. So there's nobody on the other side. So science as a field, right, this process you're talking about how we hold each other accountable, can't happen. At least just for these politically sensitive issues, that's all I'm talking about. Okay?
So, but knowing that, if there's a hot button issue, and if you want to make progress scientifically, I mean, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you've got the diversity, and you need to make sure that they follow the rules. And for me, this is much like a sports match. It's a sports match which needs to have rules. There's hitting above the belt and below the belt. There needs to be referees.
Right.
And after that, the stronger the passions, then the stronger their strictures have to be. But there is hope that as a social process that's appropriately refereed, that you actually can do science on that which we love. And I think that to me is the hopeful prognosis.
Okay, I share it, but I'd love to know your thoughts about what happened with you and the fight for getting a hearing for multi-level selection, because on that topic there was some kind of religious fundamentalism. There were, I mean, Dawkins talked about it in quasi-religious language. There was such passion, such contempt heaped on people who somehow challenged the status quo on multi-level selection. And for a long time, it was basically just you. I mean, there were a couple of other people, but what's the old joke, or maybe it's from a song, if it's one person saying it, well, he's crazy. If it's two, it's a conspiracy. If it's three, it's a movement. For a long time, it was just one crazy guy saying, wait, the consensus is wrong. Do you feel as though during those years, the marketplace of science and science ideas were working correctly and gradually you got a hearing, or what?
Well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that my status as a heretic never impeded my career.
Okay.
I got jobs, I got grants, I got publications. I was even good friends with George Williams, who is the icon of the rejection of group selection. And I'm not sure that I'd call Richard Dawkins a good friend, but we get along fine. We're in the same field. Nobody's burning me at the stake. So, and I think in that sense, science is working as intended. The bad news is it's taken much longer than it should have. And so there is something about this particular topic, and there are other topics, in which basically there's a degree of dogmatism, and words such as priest, heresy are actually used, right? We just feel impelled to say them, even though we're scientists. There's also a lot of dogmatism in the way things are taught, and scientists don't often like to be portrayed this way, but the fact is that scientific education is often by rote, just the way religious education is. You are told what to believe and what not to believe. That's all you learn, and when you're called upon to question it, you don't have the resources to do so. And I actually just completed a video cast with my former grad student, Omar Eldekar. We wrote an article in Evolution, the journal Evolution, called 8 Criticisms Not to Make About Group Selection. And it actually goes into this kind of dogmatism and this kind of education, which basically doesn't equip the average PhD, I hate to say it, who took all those courses and all they learned about group selection was don't do it.
Right.
And when they're called upon to think different, they just don't have the resources.
That's right.
So this is why science is more like religion than people care to think about. And although that has a negative component, because, for example, just telling people what to think, it also has a positive component in the sense that religions, or science like religions, has a God, which is the apprehension of factual reality, and demands of individuals much more than they can give. To be a perfect scientist is just as hard as being like Jesus.
Not quite as hard, I would say.
And relies on a social process in order to accomplish its goals, which it only does sort of, only partially achieves its ideal. So of course, that gets me in trouble with scientists when I say that science is like.
But let's just frame it a little bit differently and say, yes, it's not perfect, it's got these problems, but to be said in its favor, all the examples I give about denial of evidence in psychology, denying IQ and IQ tests and heritability, all that stuff, it tends to just go on for 20 or 30 years. After a generation or two, once the evidence is really insurmountable, the generation that denied it never changes its mind, but the next generation does say, "Whoa, the evidence is pretty good on this." So I think science is truly self-correcting more than religion could be.
Yeah, and with a little more careful design, it could work faster. So
That's right.
10 or 20 years seems short, except when you're an individual living those 10 or 20 years, and that seems awfully long. Well, this is a great conversation, and of course we could go on forever, and I look forward to many more, including more interviews on this view of life. But for the moment, this is David Sloan Wilson signing off for Revolution, This View of Life. And thank you very much, John.
My pleasure, David.